On the motion, this House supports open borders. PM whenever you're ready.
All right, let me get a timer up, but in terms of POIs, please put them in chat. I significantly prefer that over verbal ones because they can be a little distracting. Let me get my timer. Okay, I'll begin in three, two, one. First, some important framing. I like to note that open borders doesn't necessarily mean that the world is incredibly chaotic. I think this is more likely to look a lot like the Schengen Agreement, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, in Europe, where individuals have the ability to move, live, and work across countries without having these quotas and restrictions. States, as the info site tells you, they still have targeted security checks that they can run, there's still public health risks they can assess, and there's still administrative systems that they're able to use to, regulate and register individuals that come in, tax them, and welfare and stuff like that. First, some brief preemption to OO. I think that the dynamic that we've seen happen in Europe with the Schengen Agreement has illustrated two important things. First is that movement tends to not happen very quickly over time. People tend to move along with job opportunities and stuff like that, which is under the systems where a lot of people end up moving. And also, people want to have language and cultural familiarity, so people tend to move to countries closer to them. But second, not everyone moves. Migration is often constrained by things like cost, risk, family, wanting to live in a place that is culturally similar to the place that you grew up, to the place that you've become familiar with. So if Op wants to run the case that everything's going to be chaotic, welfare systems are going to be overwhelmed, whatever, I think there are a lot of burdens that they need to prove this, and they shouldn't just be able to assert this. Let's get to the OG case. The first push that OG is going to tell you into the round about why open borders just makes it significantly easier for people fleeing harm to be able to migrate into countries. First, what are the problems that exist in terms of refugees fleeing within the status quo? The refugee system is incredibly slow, but also incredibly narrow in what the definition is. Many people who have genuine danger don't have the ability to access them because the barriers in the status quo require that refugees provide a legal definition and justification for persecution to stay within a country on the reasons of being prosecuted for race, religion, political opinion, and stuff like that. If people flee generalized violence or gang control or things like this, these are things that are often don't qualify for these conditions. But also these claims often require evidence and documentation that a lot of these people, if they are fleeing or if they're from a poor country, don't have the ability to do or oftentimes do not have. But this processing also takes a really long time. It can take months and years upon to get approved for these programs and stuff like that. Many countries also will just have caps on the amount of refugees that can come in, which we do not necessarily have on our side. Like if you necessarily look then at what open borders necessarily causes. I think that it means that people then don't need to fit into this necessarily smaller legal category in order to just have the ability to move within general. It's easier to physically relocate, and you don't need to wait to have this legal recognition because there are places like nonprofits that provide funding and care about, these individuals who exist in countries where have these conditions. But the problem is this money that they are is the legal definition, and this is what will bar them from being able to get into the country in the first place, but also be able to stay there. This is also just empirically true within the 2010s within Schengen that the open borders that existed within Europe meant that people that were fleeing crises across the areas that are outside Schengen a little bit further away to be able to relocate and flee from conflict. I think the impact of this looks like a family that would in the opposition world be stuck in a place like a refugee camp in Lebanon or something with very limited schooling being the subject of conflict and bombing and stuff like that. On our side, they have the ability to travel more quick to a country where they will be more safe, where they aren't necessarily going to fall victim to a lot of these systems. I think this is incredibly important because even if this happens on a smaller margin, an OO is going to come with you a lot of mitigating responses. The impact of this is massive. These are families and people that have to deal with an infinite amount of sufferings. They are have to deal with violence from gangs that exist in their realms. They have to have children that live in countries where there are constantly bombs flying over their heads, and they live every day, not knowing if their life will continue. The magnitude of the suffering that these people feel is something we should deeply care about within this motion. Sure, I'll take the POI from CO.
Are there no gangs in the Western world? Are there no bombings in the Western
Oh, wait,
world?
obviously it's like comparative. Like I think that like the United States or like other more wealthy countries within Asia probably have like better conditions. Like obviously every country has problems, but there's always relatively better places that people can go to, and then are like conditionally better for them. Second, why do open borders improve labor? I think it's a problem that exists within the status quo. Again, is that there's extensive legal and also just economic barriers that can exist when it comes to working across borders. Work visas are often capped, or they need to be employee sponsored by employers for you to be able to go into the first place. And a lot of companies aren't willing to put on this risk because if they're not sure if an employee is going to be able to come within the first place because of flights, because of fleeing risk and stuff like that, they may just not even give the work visa within the first place. So there's also hesitance from companies wanting to offer with them, or they may be like discrimination in terms of like skill or like income thresholds among these individuals. But often, individuals who aren't like more well off are not able to get these as well. Legal pathways that do exist tend to be quite slow and very uncertain for these individuals. This means that a lot of individuals get trapped in economies that are a lot lower productivity, where wages may be lower and they don't have the ability to necessarily develop as much, not because they aren't good employees, not because they don't put in effort, but because of weak infrastructure that exists within the community and country that they were born in, that they did not have the choice to be lived in. I think that the change that you get on government then means that you have workers from other countries that are able to necessarily go into countries with less restrictions, that they don't have to deal with all these bureaucratic barriers, and then be able to work. We could also see this empirically that happened within the Schengen Agreement, where you had workers that came from poor European countries within like Eastern Europe, moving to countries like Germany, moving to countries like the UK, and being able to make higher wages and just become a lot more productive workers. But also importantly, beyond like just the, ability of an individual to massively improve their life, get higher income, and just live a lot better, this also is good for these countries like Germany and the UK because it helps fill labor shortages. A lot of these individuals may be willing to work in industries because the wages that they offer, because they are richer companies, to exist in industries like care work, like construction and stuff like that, are still significantly higher than the wages that they would get back home, which means that they are able to offer benefits to the domestic labor markets. There's also yeah, so I think that the important change you necessarily get under open borders is that individuals have more of a freedom when they are workers, when they are laborers, to necessarily move around more freely. They can be more productive, make it so economies necessarily function better, but also get paid more. Like this ability to get higher income is incredibly important because now you unlock a class of individuals who don't even have access to this because of arbitrary rules that they were born into this country, which they don't have the ability to necessarily be able to develop as much to now have new opportunities to expand more. I think this is something you should weigh incredibly highly because these are people that have the ability and the capacity to expand, but because of arbitrary rules, don't have the ability ever to like see these manifest on op. I think this is something that you should again weigh incredibly highly. So happy to propose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech. Invite opposition bench, leader of opposition, whenever they're ready
Thank you. Am I audible?
and visible, yes.
Great, thanks. I'll begin in 5 seconds. This is much beyond Schengen, as the world's inequality and suffering are much higher than Europe's alone. The American dream is stronger than Francis Blair. The suffering in the Middle East is much greater than that in Eastern Europe. Note then that this is a debate in which we will push two things mainly. One argument on the overcrowding, as OG correctly points out, and a second one, which is more crucial even, on the people that stay and don't migrate, a particular stakeholder that OG points out. Note, on overcrowding. Some countries are structurally more advantageous and more appealing to people to move to. We're talking about the United States. We're talking about those that have the natural resources to be better explored and provide economic development to those places. What that means is that some of those destinations are particularly more appealing to people, and there's a greater chance that they will move. I'm not saying they'll move quickly or just chaotically, as OG like over impacts on our side, but particularly that over time, more people will go to those places. Because even if there's some damage being done to them by the quantity of migrants that are going over time, people are still gonna likely irrationally overweight this American dream and the capacity that those developed countries can provide to them, especially when contrasting them to the poor reality that they live, and they're still likely to search for those places. But then, what is the damage? Notice that when there's too many people moving towards a place that is not prepared to receive them, there's a deterioration of all the public services to some degree. We're talking about the healthcare and education mainly because of infrastructure and because of the planning capacity to attend to these people. But we're also talking about pension services, for example. Note that all of these services were designed in the first place to a particular population growth rate, which is now expanding much quicker because of the amount of people that are going. Sure, the US has a bunch of money. They're probably likely to open some hospitals and try to balance the situation. But note that the scale in which this problem occurs means that there's significant shift of attention into solving these issues, which are likely going to cost a lot of influence going. But secondly, notice that when there's too many people competing for the same space in the United States, this significantly influences the job market because now you have an overflow of potential workers competing for the same spots. When we're talking about the most vulnerable as this OG, and they're moving to a place seeking for help, they're unlikely to have very refined skills or higher education in their curriculum. What this means is that they are competing for the most basic services, and there's likely going to be unemployment because you just cannot allocate everyone to a certain spot in this sense. So note that it is likely that these people are trading off their life in this particular place that they live in to the unemployment in the US, which by default doesn't sound like that bad, but know that structurally the unemployment is dangerous as it can lead to greater rates of criminality in these places,
GOI?
and it structurally doesn't solve the weakness that you're trying to do in allowing for better living conditions for these people. OG then has to provide you with significant effort trying to show why the life conditions of these people improve, not just how they flee from the places that they're going. Because note, secondly, that it's likely going to be greater xenophobia over these people. Firstly, because there are more attacks coming from the nationalists who will be seeing a greater overflow into their place to begin with. But secondly, because people will feel poorly when they're being pointed a finger at, especially at this scale. So even if over time there's a tendency because of habit for people to try and mitigate this effort, still in the beginning there's like significant and dangerous rates of xenophobia, which can increase the violence towards these oppressed groups and lead to conflict, even if it's now inside the countries and not between different countries. Sure, I'll take the POI. Closing, please.
If someone is unemployed, do you think that's a mean and way of life that they want to sustain?
Surely it is not. But then they might not migrate. I suppose you're saying. But let's analyze then what happens to the people that stay in the country to begin with. Because the comparative is, if there's a bunch of people and the more skilled people searching for job positions, as you're saying, they will only move when they have like guaranteed better life conditions. If people, the more specialized people are moving to the US or Europe, and the other ones are remaining in the first place to begin with, note that this is particularly valid as people have like strong ties to their original place, be it because they have like business there, a bakery, you can just leave your bakery, or because of identity ties or because of family, people will remain there. Note two things here. Firstly, because of the brain drain of the more skilled workers, there's less of a structural ability for the country to develop. There's less likelihood that the country will be developing technology or increasing the complexity of the products that they are exporting to other places, not necessarily countries anymore. But note that then this will lead to less development in those places and sustain or even increase the inequalities that exist in the first place. What this means is that if today the United States is more developed and are receiving a bunch of people trying to find work and trying to develop the economy, the places from which those people are going from in the first place now have less of a capacity to develop. And this is even true in the long term. You may say, oh, but those places are in war. I feel like middle income countries would also lose people to the United States in comparative, but even though those places in war have less of a capacity to develop over the long run after the war. But secondly, notice there's less of a pressure over the government or the local elites to control or develop that place. Note how this is important because particularly in the global south, government plays a very important role in the development of those places as they are the ones subsidizing and like making an active effort for development. When you lose the people with the greater capacity to provide accountability from the state, what this does, it allows for more abuses coming from the state, especially on the sides of corruption and on like just not developing the countries, not doing the fullest. On the comparative, we can increase the capacity of those people to actually call for a better place in the first time. Thank you.
Cool. I'd like to thank the leader of opposition for a fine speech. DPM whenever you're ready.
Let me pull up the timer. Okay, same thing with POI preferences. Would prefer to have them in the chat. Preferably we'll take CO, but if CO doesn't have one, OO is okay. Okay, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. I've never been more happy to have debated this topic within high school debate because I think that OO just says a lot of things that are incorrect. Let's talk about some of the things that they say. First of all, they talk about brain drain. This has nothing to do with open borders. This happens within the status quo. Brain drain, so people become either highly educated within their country or they study abroad to another country and then work there because they are very highly educated. They have the money and resources to do so. They don't prove why this happens within it. Second, on the point of overcrowding. First of all, when they talk about the thing that they ignore that OG next to you is that migration is constrained. It can't happen infinitely. OO conflates the motivation and being that people idealize the US with the actual capacity to do so. In reality, moving is expensive, it's risky and costly. Not everyone wants to do it. But when people do, they often tend to go to nearby or culturally similar destination because of a lot of these risks. It's a lot more expensive for you to fly to the United States rather than to go to a country that's more stable within your region. OO themselves concedes this. They say people have identity ties and they tend to remain within these regions. I don't understand how you're running overcrowding, but also saying that this is true. These are claims that stab themselves. But also just empirically, most migration tends to be regional. You can Google this. This happened within Europe, within Schengen. Like people have these ties and it doesn't cost as much to move further. I think this is quite intuitive. But also pull factors are diversified. The US isn't the only detractive nation. Like the US is literally declining within world perception within the status quo. Like there are rising economies that exist in certain areas, like within East Asia, within Gulf states, within Africa and places like this that also have abilities to attract migrants to want to go to these places. But also there's but then also O talks to you about like, oh, we're gonna get overcrowding within the job market. But realize that there's labor market sorting, which they never respond to you from OG, where a lot of these migrants tend to enter a lot more less desirable sectors when it comes to things like construction, things like care work, because it's still better than the relative conditions that they would experience if they didn't move from their countries within the first place, which means that you don't get this idea of overcrowding that they're trying to talk about within the job market. You can't just assert that this happens. But also, if this is true, then not everyone is going to move to the United States because people are rational. And if there is overcrowding within the market, they will move instead to somewhere regionally that they have a higher chance to find a job. Like, I don't understand, this is like also another reason that people tend to go to more regional countries because they know that it may be competitively like harder within a place. So if they think that they don't have the skills to match up to be able to find a job within Wall Street in the United States, they probably won't fucking move there. But also, they talk about like, oh, you're gonna have like welfare constraints and stuff like this. Like In the United States, you can Google this, undocumented immigrants pay more than citizens in taxes. This is just empirically true because they don't have the means to get around a lot of the tax systems that domestic people can, that like citizens can have by like donating things to art galleries and stuff like that, which means that you don't get this welfare strain because you get money reinvested back in. I already proved to you why it is that a lot of these migrants moving into these countries make up for a lot of the like labor constraints that exist. This happened empirically within the UK and Germany. But what happens is that there's job markets that these domestic people are not as willing to necessarily work in. When you get migrants who are from countries that are more willing to work in these markets because it's better than the other conditions that they would have, you can offer them these jobs without these restrictions because now they don't need to go through this incredibly laborious and bureaucratic process of trying to go through work visas, which is terrible to get through, takes a super long amount of time, and is incredibly uncertain and unstable form of employment. You actually can get these people to stay long term, to improve your economy, to pay taxes and reinvest within your system. Oh, it doesn't ever prove to you why these sources actually ever get worse. They tell you that hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. This is asserted. This is not proven. I also don't understand the scale of what this occurs. If you're going to argue that like the US healthcare system is going to become worse, like this probably happens on either side of the house. Like it's like a monopoly. Like I'm an American citizen and my healthcare is like awful. Like please prove a comparative. Then they tell you that like racism will make it so people don't want to migrate. Do you seriously think that someone who in their average daily life in a country that's experiencing war, where they don't know if their kids will be taken away by a bombing, they don't know if the drug cartel is going to kill their neighbor, and they don't know if they are going to be able to live within the next months, to see their kids be able to attend school because it's getting bombed? Do you think that these people seriously are going to think that like, but in the US people might like make fun of me occasionally if I have an accent? Do you seriously think that they buy that trade-off to not want to deal with slight racism from individuals in order to not have threats to their daily lives? I don't think so. The relative conditions that people can face when they migrate to a lot of these countries are just significantly better than the conditions that they would face if they don't move within the first place. I think this is just something that you should weigh incredibly highly because even if they experience these to some degree, like yes, racism is bad. Making these comments against people is bad, but it's better than not knowing if you're going to live or fucking die because of how terrible the conditions in your country are. There's obviously a comparative here. I'll take CO for a POI if they have one.
So when you talk about things like Schengen, for example, you're ignoring the fact that people in Schengen, the reason that there's a low level of conflict is because people are incredibly culturally homogenous. If a Syrian person comes into a
Wait,
Schengen zone and moves
this
from
is
one
not
country to
true.
another, that's
Eastern
still
Europe.
illegal.
No. Eastern Europe is like completely different than Western Europe. Like this is just not true. But also you could like say the same for like the regional migration, which I tell you why is likely going to be the regional counterfactual. Like also people in Asia tend to be more similar to other Asian countries, which is the similar to Schengen. So I don't understand this POI. Then let's get to the case that OG gives you. The first point we proved to you about why it is that refugees are going to be significantly better off. I tell you that the problem that exists within the status quo is that people are trapped behind legal barriers where they need to prove definitions that you don't have the capacity to, or just take an incredibly long time or incredibly slow to be able to do. This is something you should weigh incredibly highly. I've met to you why it is that the violence that these people face is incredibly terrible. It means that they don't know if they have the ability to live within futures in their lives. It's an awful situation that these people have to go through, and I think that being able to make it so they don't have to worry about whether they're going to see their kids live, if they're going to be able to have like be able to live in a world that is free from an extreme amount of conflict and stuff like that is an impact that you should weigh incredibly highly. But also note it has a much clearer margin than whatever OO or OP is trying to give you on like overcrowding in welfare systems, when there clearly are reasons and benefits that these migrants give back into these economies, but also they don't prove to you on a margin why it becomes worse if their like impact is the US healthcare system. But then also second, we necessarily prove to you why it is that labor markets themselves are just more beneficial. This is something that's much larger scale than the first impact, but it's also something that should be weighed highly because it's not only means that individuals get new capacity to develop themselves to improve their incomes, which is linked to like people having much better work development opportunities. They can send money back to their families and stuff like that if they move to these places through remittances, but also just helps these economies within these countries and makes it so they're able to fill a lot of these shortages within it. At the end of the day, OP is going to come up here and tell you a lot of times about overwhelming of markets and overcrowding. I think I've done a lot of rebuttal to this. I think you should pay attention to the weighing and whether the lives of these people actually improve or if O actually proves to you how they get worse.
I'd like to thank the DPM for fine speech. The yellow goes up top off when they're ready.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, perfectly audible and visible.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll begin my speech shortly. Please do the POIs through the chat or through the Zoom reaction. OG either lacks the capability of comprehending nuance or they maliciously strawman our case on purpose. Let's go with what this actually looks like. They try to point you out that there's a contradiction in your case because we say the simple fact that not every single person from Brazil will actually move to the US or people from the entire Latin America. I think it's entirely feasible for us to assume that yes, some people have closer ties for a bunch of reasons like having families that are caring more about the family, caring more about the culture, will stay in the country. That proves that in debate that some people will stay. But I think my partner already significantly analyzed to you why there is a big incentive for people for want to move for developed countries because they've been sold since the beginning the narrative, be it like in Latin America for the US and like the American dream, or be it like for in places like in the Middle East, like in Northern Africa for Europe, how these are the places where opportunities happens, how inherently these are like developed countries which are way richer, and by all of the mechanisms that OG tries to prove to you on why the situation is bad, it's unclear to me why they wouldn't take a shot. But also take the intuition, here it is. Currently, we're being it illegal and having a high risk of death. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of people try to immigrate illegally to the US and die in the process. And these are not refugees like OG are saying. These are like people that are in poverty or or have low income in Latin America or Latin America countries, but that they've been sold and buy so much the idea of the American dream that if you arrive into the land of opportunities, they can make your life there, that they risk it all and go either way. The main part of the here in OG, but ironically, is that they may only assert that people are not irrational and they never prove why people actually will do the rationality calculus. What we think happens then, what's most likely scenario, is like a lot of people from the middle income countries will move through the high income countries. The poor people from the poor countries will also try to go for the high income countries. At best, on their case, we have that some people set up for the middle income countries. So for instance, some people from Venezuela go to Brazil or go like to Argentina instead of going to the US. But that just moves the burden on who is actually getting screwed on their side of the house, because now Venezuela is a place where people are all fleeing from, and where suddenly you have all of the impacts and negative sides that my partner already pointed out to you. Why do we think then in two clashes this will be negative for the people that stay in those countries that now have a mass fleeing and mass emigration to outside countries, and why it will also be worse for the people that actually are arriving into those countries and all the situations that they'll face? Firstly, only people that stay in the country. I do want to preface here and already give rebuttals directly to the refugees point on OG. I have two main rebuttals here for those kinds of countries in this debate. Firstly, they ignore that having open borders doesn't mean that all of the other reasons why refugees suddenly die and are not able to actually complete the travel still exists, and I will posit to you they're actually increasing backlash. The reason why most likely these people can't actually go to the US is not only because the UK or Germany won't accept it or they have to go to bureaucracy, is because the own terrorist organization and the authoritarian regimes also have incentives, be it ideological or being like maintaining these people there for economical reasons and to be part of the workforce, to force them and to keep them into the country, or because they also see it as treason that they are fleeing for the Western countries. We think then in their word, if they know that it's way likely that the point where they flee and they are managed to get out of Syria or manage to get out of Iran, that they actually are able to live in France or in other European countries, that they just double down on the oppression. This means that on their side of the house, the people that stay or that are not able to flee, less people are actually able to flee in safety, because we have more likelihood of these terrorist organizations being hunting them down, or also because there is more terror being put into them. For instance, public executions of like, if you go and flee, I will execute all of your friends and all of family like on live television that didn't manage to escape with you, and that puts fear into the person. But also, secondly, I think they grossly mischaracterize what xenophobia looks on their side. I think if you look at xenophobia already happens now, you already have extreme cases of killing, extreme cases of abuse, and extreme cases of violence happening. Now imagine how much this is intensified when all all of the rhetoric of the right wing, like and of the far right, is extremely justified because it's hundreds of thousands, way more people are actually entering and feeding into the narrative of stealing their jobs and actually stealing their country, and all of the narratives that they already portray and how they're increasing the criminality rates and etc. I think on the best case as well, when they do manage to actually get to the country, they also get violence there, and it's unclear to me why that is something that is so relevant in the debate, why that it's significantly proven. Also to the point that I also proved to you that the people that do stay get worse lives overall. But to the countries that actually matter into this debate, most of the other countries that they've gone fleeing, notice how my partner already proves to you how there is brain drain and there is less capability for political accountability and political pressure. The only contention on this is like, oh, but people will move either way. I think it's dumb to not notice that even if I'm an engineer who has a lot of money, I can't get it to the US unless I get a visa. And the barriers to borders exist and are necessary for you to buy this debate as happening. On their side, they don't move all to the US because they can't, because Donald Trump is not letting them. But the point where they are able to now, and they're like companies like selling travel packages for them to actually go and live to the US or anything like that, I think it's even more likely that the high skill professionals are now leaving more their country. That means that the poorest countries now have a lack of professionals that they need for a lot of important areas. So for instance, I have a lack of doctors that are able to treat the population, but I also have a lack of people that are the ones that are capable of improving those countries in the long run. OG dooms the poor countries to poverty because the people that will be able to have 11K development are not able to do so. Closing. Opening.
Right-wing politicians in the status quo without open borders justify these harms. There's no margin on your side.
Learn comparative. If way more people are entering and way more people are then feeling accommodated because of that, the rhetoric increases and is way more likely that backlash is seen as justified because instead of a few Mexicans entering, it's just like a third of the Mexicans entering into the country alongside with all of the other world. This is incredibly intuitive and naive for you to not be able to question it. Notice then, Pen, on what does happen here. On their side, people do enter, face more violence, more xenophobia, and you actually have a worsening capabilities of actually being there. I think on the comparative, if they actually stayed on the country and the people will be led there, it's more likely these countries will develop it. It's more likely that those people will be like unlocking opportunities in job or market, especially the high-end ones. It's more likely that they will put pressure into the politicians instead of just fleeing for the other countries because that is seen as more worth it and less tiring on the get front. It means on their side, the people that do stay have a worse life overall, and the people that actually go to the country doesn't improve life as much. On the way in, I think the people that actually stay then have their life significantly worse and way more than the people that go out actually increase their lives. And that's why this is an incredibly stupid idea. Proud to oppose.
I thank the DLO for 5 speech. Everyone's all asking a good debate so far. Move to the back half, member of Government when you're ready.
Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay. Notice what OO just conceded out of their speech. There was this line where they said, when people leave the country, they're now going to have more leverage in these developed nations to do oppression on poor people. What does that concede, and why is it really important for our case? What OO just conceded is that things like oppression, things like bad governance, things that make developing nations suck are merely incentive issues. We think this is just largely true. No one's forcing you to do things like oppress the minorities. No one's forcing you to do things like cut your social safety net or scapegoat people. What we think open borders does, and this is going to be CG's major contribution to the debate, is change the political incentives of governments so they're less likely to do bad things and increase checkbacks, which decreases bad governance. We think there's 4 major ways that it changes the political governance incentives for regime leaders in developed and developing nations. Really quickly, notice this up layers OG because
not only does it says that people are going to have more ability to react to these things, but it's a better impact because it actually changes the content of these developed nations. So even if they can flee, they won't have to flee as much. It's just a way better impact because it solves even for the people that can't flee on either side of the house. We're the only one that accesses those groups of people. 4 political incentives that we actually change. First, like perception. We think that when a massive amount of people just leave your country, it looks really bad. But also, second, economic capital. We think that a lot of people, as framed by the opening half, that can move have massive economic contributions to their country. That means that they're incentivized to keep economic capital in their countries and develop the nation from the ground up. Third, we think political people and elites leaving have a lot more leverage than just those people that are like maybe wage laborers or can't leave at all. Notice that when the political elites leave, or notice that because the governments don't want the political elites to leave, they're more likely to govern in a better way for the government as a whole. The fourth reason is it just makes your job as a politician a lot harder when there's a ton of people leaving. If you buy all this stuff about overcrowding and all the warrants that OO gives you about why mass migration is really, really bad, then obviously if you're a political leader, you're going to know that too. And so you're going to govern in ways so as to mitigate that harm. You're going to develop your economy and your government better. So what are some examples of things that change? We already told you abuse. We think it's things like Xi Jinping oppressing Uyghur Muslims. Turns out he can no longer do that because they'll just flee to Nepal. Turns out it's things like Bukele oppressing and imprisoning people just because they had tattoos. Like literally you can just leave the country if you think you're going to get imprisoned, even if you buy that it's a high burden argument to like actually leave the country. We think most people are willing to like pack up and leave, even if it is a little bit hard, if the other side of the thing is you're going to be in a concentration camp or in prison. That means there are significant checkbacks, even if it's hard for you to leave in the first place because people are willing to take major steps. We think this also looks better governance, like more efforts to be competitive on your econ and development. It looks like things like analyzing the best economic policy, developing your domestic capacity, and increasing your national competitiveness. Instead of doing things like running cronyism, state nationalized markets, when you need to be increasingly competitive on the global stage to maintain the political elites and to maintain your economic base, you just do better economic policy. We think a lot of this, especially in corrupt nations, is not a capacity issue. No side really solves for that, but an incentive issue. When you have massive levels of corruption, we actually change those structures and solve for it. We think it also looks like expansion of the social safety net, this kind of derivative of the competitive econ point I just made. We also think major impact is avoiding war. Why is war and going to war a incentive issue and not a capacity issue? Well, first, just like intuition pump, right? No one is forcing you to go to war, but we also think that a lot of these wars, especially in developed nations, are motivated by like individual grudges or maintaining like a strongman sort of persona. But when your country is at war, obviously, if you have open borders, a bunch of people are going to leave to like escape the draft and like not be bombed. And so when you don't want that as the political government, you're just not going to go to war. You're more likely to use things like diplomatic negotiations, more things like soft power influence, like tariffs, if you really do have beef with this other country, more likely to just have more political conversations. Notice this is the biggest impact in the round because what is the major thing affecting things like overcrowding, things that are affecting immigration in the status quo? It's war, which is motivated not by capacity of political leaders, but by their incentives, by things like appearing strong on the global stage and like national grudges. We think even if the opposition comes up here and like, oh, small countries aren't going to compete, we think it's just not true. Like small countries can compete on cost of living and low government intervention. Living like out on the open plains is very appealing for a lot of people. That's why I'm from Oklahoma, even though California is like objectively a better state. We live there because it's cheap. Now, okay, yeah, we'll take the point before we move on to the second extension. From
Policies in corrupt nations benefit from the poverty of the population because if they get more educated, they push for more accountability and it's harder to steal public money. It's better for them that people leave and that the country gets worse because it's easier then for them to maintain corrupt and maintain cronyism and maintain their self-interest. You need to provide improving the country is the interest of the politician.
Right. So we think that like the government's secondary issue is like, ruling over people and being a dictator, right? You can't do any of that if your economy is cooked. And so people are more incentivized to attract university people, even if they're educated people, university people, all these different people, even if it is like a little bit more uncomfortable for your government because you just need tax revenue to like buy guns for your dictatorial regime. People have economic incentives which supersede their corruption incentives. The second extension is on innovation. We think innovation is cooked right now, and this is largely because of restrictive innovation. First, on capacity, it's like H-1B visas and all these different things. These are massively random. That means, like the OO says, if there's a really good engineer in a developing nation, they just can't get into the United States. It's just based on an auction system. Then there's also an incentive thing. People think researchers and big technologies don't want to move because they think they can't move back in the future, so they don't want to leave behind their family. When they can move back, you actually change their incentives and their capacity because they can move not based on an auction system. We think a lot of innovation in the status quo is concentrated in a few specific firms. It's because they have high marginal costs like AI, like green technology, like all these other things. Notice that these are things that developing nations cannot develop. You just can't have an AI startup in like Uruguay. And so they need to defend why a top AI researcher from like an African university should be forced to stay in Africa and not go outwards when there's no domestic AI capacity. What does this actually mean? We think an expansion in AI and green tech has trickle-down effects. We think it's come through things like vaccine, like green innovation, and not only does this solve things like climate change and like disease spread, but it also solves all the issues for overcrowding, which is largely a symmetric issue, but only we give you the governance and technology to actually solve the problem. Thank you.
Cool. Let's take member of government, member of opposition whenever you're ready.
Can I make sure I'm audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, perfect. I think the GovBench has an issue with being very contingent on proving a burden that none of them ever prove. That is to say, any impacts you have on green tech or whatever, I don't understand, is contingent on this integration happening well, these people actually getting access and being able to permeate these types of job markets in the first place, these policies not leading to internal crackdowns, and the most vulnerable people actually being able to escape war. What am I going to do? First, I'm going to explain to you why this idea of people fleeing violence is a very marginal and unlikely case and quite uncomparative. Secondly, I'm going to explain to you why and exactly how this kind of backlash actually happens, why it is so possible for it to happen both on a political and personal level, and why this locks out any of the impacts that we get from the other side. So first explain then this idea of people fleeing violence. I think first of all, notice that the people who come to countries and want to actually get help, and them getting help is contingent on there being a domestic will to provide this. What does this look like? Currently, this looks like there being active refugee programs to help these people, to get them aid, where you require things like organized aid, asylum, and donations. At the point at which I will prove to you that this political will and the social will is likely to not exist anymore, these types of help are also not likely to be able to be given to these people targetedly. Secondly, usually the people who are able to move fastest are not the ones who are actually fleeing violence. Why is this true? One, because the people who have the financial means and the ability to uproot, to leave quickly. Secondly, it's the people who means just like physically able to do this. It also means that the people who have the connections to be able to facilitate something like this. It means that though, the people with the worst violence probably aren't even able to escape because they're controlled by the army, it's unsafe, they don't have the money, they don't have the access. But secondly, I think it's important to note that the conflict, if it is large scale, is also likely to move itself. At the point of which you're able to facilitate such a large influx, especially initially into close countries, because sure, they can say that over a long time, it might be perfect for me to disperse into the country that's like most reasonable for me to live in, but often there are very clear limits to what this is able to be, or especially in the short term, I like to congregate in countries that are close, that are accessible. What this means then is when there's a large influx of people from similar geographically close conflicts, it is likely that both sides of that conflict flee to some degree. But even if this is not true, it means that there's large amounts of ghettoification where much of the conflict and tensions are going to be exported to these regions. Not only is this bad for the people because it means that they're less able to escape the violence, it is also bad because it means that these people are now perceived as more violent and less of the integration that you want to happen actually happens. But then let's explain the point on backlash. In the status quo, the top three issues in almost any country that are most voter salient include immigration. No developed country in the world has over 50% support for any more pro-immigration policy that currently exists. The only way that this can happen is to ignore a massive democratic preference. And every wave of immigration in Europe so far has caused a rise in the far right. Like, for example, after 2015, Germany, Orban in Hungary, like the rise of far-right parties in Italy as well. But why is this then different from what our opening is telling you? Notice our opening just mentions this, and they only mention it mostly on the political level. Notice I'm not going to be contingent on these far-right parties actually getting into power. I'm going to show you that they're very separate and distinct mechanisms that actually allow backlash to have like a very negative effect on people taking the much lower burden. But explaining why this is actually a tipping point, because this is, I think, something OO does do. One, because it's more psychologically scary to people. Even if there's some control on the amount of people who are able to come in, i.e. some level of screening at the border, simply the word open seems uncontrolled. Note that some of the scary instances then that happen in the media of some violence are much more heavily amplified. And sure, some of these happen in the status quo, but simply the psychology of the word open seems like the government is essentially doing nothing to protect you against this. Notice that the ability to simply keep your border, to have basic sovereignty of the country in terms of deciding who comes in and out, is something that people feel is very fundamental to the job of the government. Secondly, most of these countries that we are talking about have historical instances where their border safety and their sovereignty has been something that's in question. This means, for example, as a Hungarian, this is an issue that is very important to me. We have fought hard to even establish our own border, establish our own sovereignty. This means that it's probably a very politically salient issue for me to actually upkeep this. But it also just means I don't think this is just a far-right issue. I think it is very likely that people on the left and in the center also agree, because I think the extent to that this feels actually dangerous to you is much higher. Because even if the country doesn't end up being overrun by people, the word open, the fact that we are completely leaving this out of control, and the state is not using its capacity to limit this, means that I'm likely to not want this. But why do people perceive it negatively? One, it's very likely that you get a lot of ghettoification. It means that you don't have these cutesy little interactions that you might have now. Because if you have a low amount of people coming in, you probably have capacity to, like, for example, temporarily put asylum seekers with people who are willing to accept them. For example, have specific designated social housing for them. What this means in the status quo is that you meet that person as your neighbor. You meet them in the grocery store, and you probably have an extent to humanization which happens with them. Notice that at the point at which there's so many people that you cannot just put them dispersed, you probably have to create specific zones for them, because they're also probably not able at such a large scale to pay for the kind of housing that would mean that they actually integrate. What this means is that you have very little scope to actually have positive interactions with them. And I think the scale and speed in and of itself is something that is scary to people. But why is this bad? One, politically. Only because the motion fiats that open borders happen does not mean you fiat internal non-discrimination. So what are things that people are politically able to do? This doesn't just have to be the far right. If the far left does this, or the left does this, and suddenly the left is like fearing that they're going to get out of office, like look what Starmer is doing. He's completely bending to the far right will in terms of immigration. So politically, one, you do things like restrict judicial rights. You cut off foreign aid because you feel like it is job done. This is a huge impact in terms of the country from which you are receiving. You cut programs that actually help the local country. You cut the funding to protect them. You create quotas for local jobs. You don't allow them into as many local jobs, and you expand things like surveillance, police crackdowns, more incarceration, especially in these ghetto-y areas. Secondly, that in terms of the personal level, people don't hire them because they are scared of the backlash. They are scared of shareholder backlash. They are scared of risk, and they are scared of perception. They are scared that local people will not want to work in these places anymore. Secondly, people and landlords don't want to rent out to them because they feel like these people are unreliable. They feel like these people are overrunning their country and threatening their sovereignty. Third, it means that people don't want to share schools and third spaces with them. What this means is that there's an even larger incentive to move into things like ghettos. But four, it means that these people are now pushed into more of these low-income, unsafe, and unregulated jobs, because the only way that they think they can get a job is to do things like concede to less worker rights, do things like work much below the average labor. And this is something that is able to be pushed down and down over time, because these people have basically no leverage. And I think when people then move into these ghettos, it is a long-term recreating system where when you move into these systems, you have less protections. You probably turn more to things like violence, to things like stealing, meaning perception of you is even worse, and these crackdowns are even worse. But fourth, hate crimes. Notice none of this requires there to actually be a majority, because after every immigration surge in Europe, we've seen a massive increase in hate crimes because people get radicalized online because they feel like there's an uncontrollable fear. But second, the people who do hate crimes feel like there's now a larger audience who actually buy into what they do. And the people who are targeted by these hate crimes are usually the most vulnerable people, because these are the most visible ones. It's not your integrated rich person. It's the person who you feel like is in the ghetto and looks like it's going to hurt you. For all these reasons, vote for CO.
I thank the member of opposition for a fine speech. Remind all speakers here why an important part of the game fact for the close decision and speaks, so please take them when offered. That being said, government whip does the opposition bench whenever they're ready. Remind all speakers again, POI is an important part of the game factor into close decisions and speaks. Before Obwhip speaks, I need to run to the bathroom just to take like a minute. I'll be back.
Is the panel ready, by the way? Hi.
Okay, sorry about that. Opposition went whenever you're ready.
Is everything fine now?
Yeah, audible and visible.
Okay, great. If the panel is ready, 3, 2, 1. Let's start with CG. I think they have somewhat of a weaker case. So they try to push 4 main points. One they neglect later on, but let's see. They say if people are fleeing governments, then the governments will have a better motivation to improve. Well, presumably you live in a democratic country in which governments already have an electoral incentive to make their country better, right? Because if you don't improve the living standards, then even if people don't flee, you will probably lose the upcoming elections. Very basic mechanism. So you have already incentives. Let's say these incentives doesn't exist and we live under a government who doesn't give a shit about the economic politics or whatever is going on under their country. Why is people leaving the tipping point if they don't care about the status of the economics anyways? Then I think they don't have a delta here regardless. Secondly, they say even if you're a terrorist or a gang member, you can escape prosecution and go to Europe, right? Well, probably no, right? Like if you're in Sesot in El Salvador or a concentration camp in Xinjiang, they're not going to tell you, oh, now we have open border policy, so you're free to leave, right? So the second part is open border works one-sided, right? If the country you live under thinks that you're a terrorist or you're a gang member or if you're a criminal, they would probably not let you leave the country in the first place. You can go to Europe and maybe they accept you after the security check, but I also don't believe that once they see a El Salvadorian gang member with face full of tattoos, they would still probably be rejected in even under open border circumstances. But let's assume they're not. The main country, the host country, would probably not let them to leave because open border means open entry, not open exit. Third part, they say less wars. And member of government says this 3 times that it is the biggest impact, which I think VIP makes a smarter move by not whipping that part because like the incentives of war, I don't understand. Like if immigration is so good, the immigration hotspot US is the main reason of the biggest wars in the past century, right? Like I cannot see the motivational change that much here, and I don't think it's reasonable. The last part they say is about innovation. This is where the difference in the debate starts. I think this is what makes us different from the top half as well, because we are the team that stratifies the types of immigrants and how these processes work on in the comparative as well. What do I mean? The best engineers from developing world, they say, as per their analysis, can't come to US or Uruguay, so we don't have AI startups. Well, let's assume a great man from Somalia, which is a great AI mind, happened to migrate to Uruguay. Will Uruguay have the infrastructure to support the Somalian engineer skills? Do they have a local AI hub to make sure that meaningful interaction happens? Probably no, right? How many AI engineers do you need to make sure that they go to Uruguay for a tech hub to be happen in Uruguay? And let's assume we save Uruguay. How cannot we like how is it gonna trickle down to bordering countries? It is pretty much unreasonable. But in the status quo, we also say that the biggest minds around the world are already fleeing to UK, already fleeing to US, and innovation doesn't happening is kind of like empirically untrue as well, right? So all of their points are very speculative. the biggest pushback we receive from them is contact theory. They say, oh, well, actually, if you spend so much time with them, you normalize them. With this logic, slavery should have ended in 20 years, right? We give 5 minutes of fucking analysis as per why this contact theory wouldn't work out, of how people's psychological and political incentives shape how they react with the immigrants, pushing them into way worse scenarios than the alternative. Let's continue with OG. They say fleeing harm is easier. What is the harm exactly in the comparative? I think all harm factors OG defines are rooted in poverty, right? They say some people live in poor areas which they didn't choose to live under. Sometimes they have higher crime rates, etc. Well, this is not the case always, right? Western world has a great soft power that creates this imaginary world of opportunities that is given to everyone in the non-Western world, in the third world countries, developing worlds. If you look at anyone in Turkey, they would tell you that opportunities are so great in the Western world. Once you go, you would be living your best life. But in reality, what we prove to you is this is not the case most of the times. Even if you don't live under poverty, the thinking that you would live the Hollywood dream would push you and incentivize you to migrate under open borders, because you do not require to go through the visa process. In most probably you would be rejected. What we are proving you here is simple. The backlash will happen, and politically, these people will be locked out of places that are most crucial for their well-being. More incarceration will happen. They will receive the less rights. These all the benefits CG tries to push by, like Finland has great social welfare systems, etc., will not be working towards them because these people are not citizens in the first place. That's why overcrowding that our opening talks about, the social welfare and public functions, will not happen either, because probably these people won't be going to public schools anyways, because they're not citizens. In most countries, the systems will shape and the political systems will shape in such a way that push these people into private schools because they're not citizens, because this is going to be the biggest political incentive mechanism. And at the end of the day, they will be working under circumstances that doesn't have job safety. They will be working under minimum wage. And all of these reasons were reasons that things that they did not expect. They were having better situations in their host country probably, but once they arrived in the country that they want to migrate, they realized the harsh reality of the world. They suffered. Any POIs, by the way? OG?
Yeah, OG.
Yeah, go on, please.
OG flips the CO backlash claim. It's harder for immigrants to be blamed when you guarantee more documentation and less people enter illegally, and you can prevent criminals from coming in better.
Well, like we agree with that documentation, but documentation happens on our side. Like our comparative is like you have more regulated places. You know that even if there's an influx, you know how many people are gonna come, so you can create areas that are not ghettoized. All of these structural benefits that you can get is on our side when you have regulations and visas. Pretty easy. And then what OO tells us? See, couple points. First of all, they say, I think OG does a great job in mitigating OO as well, but they say Middle East will have a lower brain capacity and slower growth trajectory. This problem is very much solved by stratification analysis. Well, two burdens. Second burden is the most important one. I will go with that. If the top engineers and doctors or best students of Turkey wanted to come to Germany, why can't they now come? What is the delta? I think the visa system targets the best brains already, and they don't prove the delta. So our impact weighs over with a larger scale. Why does amount of doctors matter if there are less people to cure, right? The core of our argument is easily taking over these teams because it doesn't contingent on uncertainty mechanisms. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. And I thank the opposition whip for a fine speech. Now, a really great debate. We'll see you all in 15 minutes because this round is open.
Thank you very much for the debate.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So you want to take a minute to look over your notes, come up with an initial call, or just let me know when you have an initial call just before a minute.
For sure.
Cool. Do you need any more time or are you ready to get started?
Yeah, I have an initial, although I'm not sure. This debate is slightly messy.
Sure, you go ahead.
Cool. So I have CG first. I have OO second, OG third, and CO fourth. Not sure where to put CO. I think happy to discuss where they stand here.
Yeah, cool. So there's some fun differences. I like differences in polls. I haven't had differences so far at this competition. So I have opening government, closing opposition, opening opposition, closing government. So maybe
Interesting.
the easiest way to, sorry, say that again?
No, interesting, I said.
Oh yeah. So let's look at closing government, opening government. So just going to try and shift closing government around. So that's the biggest divergency.
Mhm.
Do you want to explain why in maybe a minute what you think closing government is adding to the round and what you think is beating opening government?
Yeah, so I think to a large extent, this is interesting. So I think closing government does two things that is pretty interesting. Number one, they explain, although the characterization of like how migration looks like is somewhat different in opening government, OG says that, look, you probably migrate to like nearby countries. He just like, oh, but you probably migrate to US. I think this takes the flip side of like even if that OG shies away from, which I do credit to them to a large extent. Secondly, I think the argument that they have deals with the comparative that OG also shies away from. So OG doesn't really talk about like the like what happens to like the in terms of like backlash in the original country, like what happens with like people from within like if you move away from Indonesia, for instance, what happens there. I think they explain that specifically the incentive structure with politicians sort of changes, and I think this is a question that I thought was unanswered by the end of by the end of top half. Although I do think that OG has an interesting principle that might make me flip. I'm just not sure whether they prove that principle.
Cool. So my read of opening government is as follows. So the reason they don't engage with the clash of what happens in general immigration is because they successfully weighed why what happens to refugees should matter most in the round, either because of severity of impact, but largely because of severity of impact and indeed of margin of change. Additionally, they have explanations to why it's likely to be the case that migration, in the cases of the rest of the debate, which isn't refugees, would be in local areas, as in cultural harmony, ease of access, etc. And that's where the vast majority is. So even if closing government is now saying we're going to talk about immigration that happens on a global level, opening government is described why that's not the majority of instances we're likely to talk about because of the incentive structures of migrants themselves. So even if now closing government is talking about different group of migration, by opening government's analysis, that's not the majority of instances. Even if it's the case, and then they are thirdly shying away from the argument of things like overcrowding. I do think the responsive work by opening government is sufficient to say that opening opposition have yet to prove a mass level of number of individuals moving to create the overcrowding effect itself. So the reason opening government has not done a lot of material here is because the first line of their responsive engagement that dismantled opening opposition's claim of overcrowding worked successfully. That is my view of the opening of government. I'm not sure what you think the principle of opening government is, though. I don't think I tracked the principle argument other than just saying it's arbitrary, which is just what CG repeats.
Yeah, that's what I thought as well. I don't think they proved it, which is why I'm not really that convinced by OG's principle. Although in terms of like your explanation, I do think so my read's a bit different. So OG says that you move to like gradually to a large extent and you move to like similar countries. But I think the analysis on CG is irrespective of whether or not you move to like nearby countries or further away countries. It's just like if you move away, then politicians are less able to exploit or like do whatever bad things that happens in you. If the principal OG is like, oh, but either A, in middle income countries, the government is pretty bad and you have zero infrastructures, or B, like you are in war-torn states, then to a large extent, it is the case where the majority of cases of like having middle income countries not being able to move out also deals with the comparative that OG doesn't talk about, because I think most of their analysis hinges on like either one, they talk about people who are in like Syria or Iran or like Middle Eastern countries with war, or B, like in terms of job security, it's more towards like people from middle income countries who are able to move out. I think CG's analysis for both, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I don't think necessarily opening government is just talking about people who are richer, for instance. For instance, they talk about predominantly people who aren't richer, as in those are people who are going to fill labor shortages. And that's the comparative reason it doesn't create a labor market overcrowding effect, because the places that these people will go to, like construction or social work, are not what the predominant citizens was. But in order to add additional justification here, and this is where I'm going to be more critical to closing government says they don't need capacity analysis to describe why the developing nation will change, because opening opposition has conceded that the only thing is incentives that the developing countries need to change their behavior. Number one, that's not true. And number two, even if that was true, that doesn't affect the government bench comparison on analytical veracity. So the end of closing government, all they say, maybe the incentives of developing countries will shift. Although I do think the POI from opening opposition is sufficient to say the incentive could be to just crack down further, as in this is the POI that comes to a member of government that poverty is good to consolidate power, which actually the response is just no, because you necessitate tax and economic development. That doesn't necessitate freedom, as all like dictatorships can point to. On the government bench, then, an absence of capacity justification to explain why a developing nation, just because it's now incentivized to solve oppression, would solve oppression. Like the examples, I think, are widely unintuitive. As in, if we allowed open borders, Xi Jinping would no longer crack down on the Muslims in Uyghur because they can leave to Tibet. Like, what are you talking about? I think, therefore, the justifications themselves are weak compared to opening government. Is this sufficient to change your mind, or you still think that the generalizability of both the innovation and now bad countries will do good stuff is sufficient?
No, I think that makes sense. Although I don't think it's a pretty far margin between OG and CG. Even after hearing that, I'm happy to flip though.
Okay, so we have OG beating CG. In my mind, it is a large margin, but we just have a disagreement on the margin. When it comes then to placing closing government against other teams, let's do short diagonal then. So you have closing government beating opening opposition. Do you want to explain briefly why you think this should be true?
Yeah, so I do find it interesting that you pointed out that O has a POI to CG that says like, oh, but like it's easier for you to crack down. I'm not sure like why particularly that is like the like overarching incentive structure that triumphs over the CG analysis, because like I think it's fair for you to say that that is a possibility, but I think CG proves the incentive structure in terms of like if these are people who are corrupt, then they probably like to have money, and if you cannot exploit people's money to a large extent, then probably that like your incentive structure changes somewhat. I think OO does need to prove why specifically money is not the only incentive that people like why money is not this incentive that people have. They give a competing analysis. They don't have a direct refutation over that to a large extent. I think they could have preempted that, but like, fair enough. But overall, I do think the analysis that O does push is like things like brain drain, or at least like to a large extent, what happens is that you are unable to develop. I think to like, the CG case does flip that comparative to say that if it is the case that you have less people to be able to develop, that is reliant on the initial country having bad conditions as a result of politicians treating them badly. CG is like, no, but then the incentive structure changes in which you want to make sure people stay, so you make better policies as a result. I think this is probably like much more realistic for me. But even without that, I think like the independent benefits is enough to like also counter O's claim. Like not counter, but like I think there are some independent benefits that stays in CG as well.
So this probably just feeds into the work I've already done on Gov Bench is, whilst I agree with you that the POI from opening opposition is not devastating, as in they do not comprehensively show that is the only way in which a dictatorship or a strong man would now respond to the incentive. However, I have three responses. The first is the closing government justification for why migration means that you're going to respond economically well is the things like to prevent brain drain or prevent the leaving of political elites. Fine. You have now an incentive structure to stop this happening. Maybe it's the case that developing nations now change what they do, whether though I don't even know what the margin of that success is. So maybe now they are doing different types of policies. Is the end terminal impact here now people don't leave, or people who stay there are now better? If that is true, then opening opposition has some gestured analysis on the inverse that might appeal to an equal number of instances, as in the sort of bizarre but interesting claim from opening opposition that they will just force you not to leave if they need you so much. As in, and indeed, this is what opposition weight points out again, is like the freedom of entering into a country is distinct from the freedom to leave a country. With that, then, I just do think the incentive analysis exists. I just don't think it achieves a sufficient margin to show that the nation will actually change in a way that is, good. Independent of that, then, even if you think the developing nations are going to be good, how do you weigh this against the effects of the people who will leave regardless, particularly on the arguments of overcrowding, arguments of xenophobia, and arguments about why elite individuals per CG's analysis who are probably likely to still be connected will leave anyway, and thus you'll have aspects of brain drain. So how do you respond particularly to the first claim then? Or how do you weigh the argument of overcrowding versus the ability for developing states to change their behavior?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part? I think I'm kind of laggy here.
Oh, sorry. So if we take closing government analysis at their best and say it is true, then the thing we are asked to weigh on is why is it the case that what happens to people who have left that country, as in the overcrowding affects the amenity, the xenophobia, matters less than this developing country now developing better?
Mm. Um, that makes sense. Let me scroll through my notes and I'll give you a better response. Okay. I see where your point is. Although to a large extent, do we think that opening opposition does prove like, terminally impact their arguments as well? Because I think they're quite rhetorical, if that makes sense.
I think the level of analysis from opening opposition, to my mind, is stronger than closing government. And indeed, I think the impacting from both teams is not as strong. I think it's like there's no difference in terms of impacting between both teams in my mind.
Okay, that makes sense. If that's the case, then I'm happy to like flip as well. I was
Okay.
not as I think like even though closing government's impacting wasn't that strong, it's still slightly marginally more impacting compared to O, which I was slightly swayed. Fair enough.
Okay.
Circuit
Cool.
difference.
So other remaining, well, we have 2 minutes or 3 minutes left. So let's focus on maybe a comparison that is important here. So you have closing opposition last in the round. I have them quite high up. So let's just talk about them so they can factor at least this into the OA. So why would you have closing opposition losing out to open opposition?
So the reason why I think CO, so I'm having a hard time valuing CO's analysis because to a large extent, albeit they did give you more mechanisms to why something is true, it's still quite derivative to opening opposition. And like if we buy the premise that like, to a large extent, OO does prove some of the analysis that I'm not sure because I think OO does explain why specifically you will have things like xenophobia, and they explain that the rhetoric is probably stronger given that you would have like more people coming in. I think CG like tries to approach the same analysis by explaining that people just generally care about like things like sovereignty, or like at least people not having jobs is probably worse off, and they're probably like backlash against the people in like financial like social ways and all that stuff. I think this is quite similar. Maybe they explain it in a quite more crystallized way. I'm just slightly hard like I'm finding a hard time to value their arguments as well. So my biggest problem is like if we see CO as non-derivative, I'm happy to place them higher. My only problem is that I think they are currently slightly derivative to OO, which makes them lower than OO.
So I do think closing opposition are running an analytical extension, but to answer your question directly, I do think the analysis is stronger, but I just want to explain why I think that is true. Even if we granted opening opposition everything, that people will respond in a xenophobic way to losing your job, that is the end point of the analysis, whereas closing opposition argues why lots of individuals will likely have that feeling, why it is likely that overcrowding will result in ghettoization, which will separate people from the migrants, which will create and allow animosity to fester, and then why the conditions of those migrants will be worse as a result of being in a ghetto and thus demonized, which is, I think, is a stronger challenge to opening government, other than just saying these people's lives, the asylum seekers' lives will be worse because of xenophobia. A lot of closing opposition then justifies why there's other aspects of their dynamic within a developed nation that would be worse now, as in they wouldn't get access to the types of amenities as freely as opening government thought they should have in order to get into the country, and why that's an advantage. So those are the 3 levels of analysis I think CO is adding to scale the certainty and the comparative margin, and indeed the responsive challenge.
Okay, I'm happy to place them second then, because I think even if that's true, it doesn't deal with like OG's analysis of like how the severity of impacts matters more than like all of these other things, because OG does explain that having racism is probably better than like living in a war-torn state. I think CO's analysis, at least like, oh, but you have refugee camps, is quite mitigatory. OG does preempt that to a large extent, so they still are under OG, but I'm happy to place them above opening opposition, given that they do explain the intricacies of like the interaction and how people internalize the political, like at least the political climate and how this looks like within those destination countries. Fair enough.
Cool. So that means we end up with the call of OG, CO, or CG. Let me know when you have the ballot up.
Yep.
Do you have the ballot up? Sorry,
Yep.
just because we're running out. I don't want. Oh,
Yes.
You do. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So if we go from fourth to first, and fourth we had closing government with Sullivan speaking first and Hiya speaking second. going to read out a bracket. Tell me if you agree this describes either of their speeches. Arguments are almost exclusively relevant and address most of the core issues. Occasionally, often arguments may slip into deficits of explanation, simplistic argumentation, peripheral or irrelevant argumentation.
Yep, fair enough.
Do you have a preference for either speaker?
Preference to member, perhaps?
Okay. So would that be a 76, 75? Or do you think largely all of the member of government speeches fit that bracket?
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's quite fair if we go by like the deliberation. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the team that came third, which was opening opposition. We had Fernando speaking first and Guilherme, I don't know how to pronounce his name, sorry, in yellow.
Yeah.
Do you think they're within the same bracket as member of government, closing government?
Yes. I'm not sure. For me, it's quite close, so I would just, unless you disagree.
No, I think is 77, 76 sufficiently close for you? Is in a 2-point margin, or would you prefer to be closer?
Would you be fine with like a 1-point margin?
Sure, yes. So then we just pair our 76s.
Yeah.
Cool. And then we get the team that came second, which was closing opposition, Annamaria speaking first, Aslan speaking second. I do think in terms of the strength of analysis, they enter into the higher bracket, which is the arguments are relevant and address the core issues of the debates, well made without obvious logical gaps, nor well explained.
Yes.
Do you have a preference for either version of the speaker? Recognizing that member opposition did not take a POI, which we should factor into speaks.
I have a preference to member of op. I think op was slightly less uncharitable at responding to.
Yeah. I think some of the responses were funny though. But yeah,
yeah, fair enough.
no, but yeah, that's not. I'm not saying that is a legitimate metric. I just wanted to say that the recording. So given that the member of opposition did not take a POI, are you find equalizing even if you think there's a natural preference to MO?
Yes.
That'd be a pair of 81s.
Sorry, what?
Do you think a pair of 81s is fair, as in they are within arguments relevant, address core issues well made without obvious logical gaps?
Would you be fine with a pair of 80s instead?
So what is your reasoning for why they should be lower in the bracket?
Oh, I just don't think that's OpWhip deserves that as 81, or perhaps you disagree.
I suppose some of the responses are not well explained, and I think most of them aren't well explained. They're left to one-line types of responses, which for most part were fine, but not well explained. So a pair of 80s will be fine. Based on that discussion we just had. And then member of opening government, we had Kira speaking first and second. Did you have a preference for either version of their speeches? And do you think they're within the same bracket as closing opposition?
I have no preference. I think they're both quite fine.
I think all the parts of their speech are well explained.
Yes,
and
agree.
without an obvious logical gap, so it'll be a pair of 82s. I don't think necessarily they are. I don't think any part of it requires necessarily a really strong response. I might be tempted to give the member as a Prime Minister 83, largely because parts of the asylum case I do think do demand a strong response. However, absence of an explanation to why it would change migration routes, if that makes sense, because I actually think there is just a level of response about why they would face loads of danger anyway, or the level that I think that is something that I think takes it from strength to weakness, in my mind, but that maybe it's arbitrary. But 82 is fine. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. And then we'll mark the second one as a duplicate because I think that's the way that works. Yeah. Okay, I'll just reread the ballot to make sure we're all agreeing. So PM was Kira in 82, DPM was Kira also in 82, with the second speech of Kira is marked as a duplicate. Leader of opposition was Fernando at 76. DLO was Guilherme at 76. MG was Sullivan in a 76. Government whip was Hiya at 75. Emma was Annamaria at an 80. Opposition whip was Aslan at an 80. Yeah?
Oh, yes. Hold on. I accidentally submitted ballot. I'll just contact Tab because I think I accidentally inflated member of op a bit. I'll just tell Tab I misinputted. Okay, thank you so much.
Could you, if it's possible, could you invite the team back in? Yeah, thank you so much. Okay. So do we have at least one member from each team here? So I can see Kira. He's Kira here.
Yep.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh no, sorry, yeah. The OO.
Pierce, I
Yeah.
think you're in the wrong room.
Okay, so we're still waiting for CO, I think. We'll just tag OO in the Okay, do we have CO? No, don't have CO. Okay, I'm gonna give them a minute when we get started. Cool. Do we have CO? Yeah, okay, I can see Aslan here. Cool. So we have one member from each team. So that's a bit more sociable. And so we can get started. Cool. Cool. So thanks everyone for the debates. In terms of general feedback, I think the only thing that is applicable largely to all teams is when responding to teams, try to respond to either all elements of a claim, particularly if teams have done a good job of weighing one part of their case above others. The second is when giving responsive engagement, make sure to be less, don't just be shallow with the responses. Like even if you think the response has taken out the claim because the claim was weakly analyzed, you can also go a bit further to make sure you insulate that against for future challenges that may emerge. Those are only the two things that I think were generally applicable to all speakers in the round. Cool. We had some divergent conceptions of what the call should be, but we did reach a unanimous decision. I'll try to reflect as much as possible the discussion we had in order to give veracity to the debate itself. So in the end, the unanimous call is the first goes to opening government, the second to closing opposition, the third to opening opposition, and the fourth to closing government. Why is that the case? So I'm not going to explain every element. So I'm not going to describe every element in detail on the round. I'm just going to explain things that we thought would be important interactions. This is just to say if I don't say something, it's not because we didn't track it, it's just because we don't think it's essentially useful to resolve clashes. And I will describe as much as possible why the metrics we were given were I'm giving are the metrics that we should have used. On the top half then, opening government argues, so the first question at top half is there is two different stakeholders. So we have people who are asylum seekers on opening government and the fact that we are now providing them an access and a route to countries that otherwise they wouldn't have by getting rid of visa constraints of bureaucratic mechanisms, i.e. now they frame that a lot of asylum seekers don't have documentation in the first place and thus wouldn't be accessible to getting asylum routes. And thus they are benefited because they've been removed from aspects of violence or camps that they would otherwise be in that country. And they're not probably moving across the entire world, but probably just a local area. Versus opening opposition's arguments about people en masse, which I presume requires beyond asylum seekers and just immigration and migration, economic migration in general, and then resulting in things like overcrowding, etc. In terms of the first question, which is which of these stakeholders do I care most about? Opening government has provided me quite clear and strong weighing to suggest why I should care predominantly about what happens to the lives of asylum seekers as opposed to the lives of general migration or indeed other people's lives like in the country, etc. I.e. this is the level of violence these people are being reduced, etc. Opening opposition has a number of responses here that we don't think were sufficient to get around the type of weighing. The first was to describe that they maybe will not get access to the types of jobs and amenities they talk about, either because of aspects of overcrowding. Prima facie, this response is insufficient because the severity of removing themselves from violence, etc., weighs, I think, more intuitively, more powerfully in our minds than the idea of economic access. And I think opening government does this justification quite well, both intuitively and practically. The second is, even if it is true that opening opposition are trying to justify there is a reduction in economic access, I don't think they ever really successfully respond to the DPM push that actually when you become economically integrated within a country, either you're not going to go into areas that are overcrowded, you do local movements, which wouldn't create the overcrowding effect, or the movement would be so gradual not to create the massive bursting crowding effect to begin with, or failing those two things, if people are becoming economically integrated, that provides a tax base and the revenue that expands amenities like healthcare and education. Opening oppositions doesn't have a response to this. So that all we're left with thinking is this a sufficient level of analytical response? And then obviously there's things missing here, which is why will the government take the taxation revenue and do these things with them? But if it's such the case by our intuition that overcrowding would be a harm to the citizenry, then things like democracy probably would take place, etc. And thus you would have amenity access. But even if that's not true, in opening opposition thinks they did successfully prove overcrowding amenities, the weighing by opening government on asylum seekers and the way in which their welfare is uniquely affected by the safety of their environment is still beating them, even if that amenities case was proven to its fullest extent. The second thing that then opening opposition does is trying to challenge rather than just the economic access of these migrant communities, are talking about their safety in other dimensions, as in aspects of things like xenophobia. Opening opposition says that a downstream impact of things like overcrowding is that there is not just now, obviously, symmetric xenophobia, but the justification behind the xenophobia becomes stronger, which means you have more xenophobia. Opening government here, I think, in terms of their POI engagement, opening opposition is a bit weaker here. Like, I do think it rests upon the intuition that just xenophobia already happens. Right-wing people do it anyway. They don't need a legitimate cause in order to expel xenophobia. Thus, xenophobia will remain the same. I do think to opening opposition's credit, it is somewhat intuitive that the more at which there's overcrowding and the more which there is justification for people on their daily lives to see the effects of migration, maybe they are more likely to be engaged with xenophobia. But that's being very charitable to opening opposition. Obviously, there's I think empirical examples the AID would know where actually the inverse relationship is found in society. But devoid of that, let's just take opening opposition at their best and say that is true. Even if there's an increased level of xenophobia, it once again doesn't challenge the severity weighing by opening government, which is fine, there may be levels of hate crime, aspect of violence, but why is that violence to the same level that would otherwise emerge from what opening government's characterization implies these people would have to deal with otherwise? I don't think it is as severe, and thus the severity weighing remains true for opening government. The last thing that opening opposition tries to challenge is to say that actually the level of asylum migration wouldn't change. Indeed, they would still have to go through very violent routes, or the fact that they could now access the developed nations means that things like terrorist organizations or strongman leaders would crack down and prevent them from leaving, etc. This is an interesting yet but underdeveloped response. So obviously opening government does not have any material to describe why the migration routes themselves would become better. We're left to the intuition that if there are legal routes, then there would be legal means to get there. Although I don't think it's fair for me to say that opening government successfully demonstrated that, and thus this response doesn't work. So the response from opening opposition here partially works to describe why the level of remediation of violence isn't as strong as opening government wants, as in maybe you'd be tyrannized a bit more in countries like one you're trying to leave, and maybe the route to get there would be as harmful. But there's still a margin to opening government about the people who now can get into the country, and we still believe that some people, a good level of asylum seekers, can now access the country when otherwise they wouldn't have been able to, and indeed are no longer accessing it illegally, but accessing it legally, which means they can have access to protections and rights, etc., even if they've been partially mitigated by opening opposition to overcrowding arguments. We don't think the overcrowding argument got to the sufficient level to preclude any asylum seeker from being able to enter some aspect of amenity access or just some aspect of safety. Obviously, that margin becomes closer as a result of the DLO response. Opening government would have been better if they had defended preemptively that claim stronger. And I do think it's fair that opening government should have expected this challenge, even if it comes in DLO, it's still worthy to talk about in top-up comparison. But at the end, then, it's the weighing from opening government on the actor or stakeholder of asylum seekers that clearly wins the day from opening government. But I do think opening government responds to the challenge to the general way in which immigration be integrated into society, i.e. by local slow movement, does sufficiently mitigate the argument of overcrowding, such that I'm not clear if overcrowding and the economic harms opening opposition say occurs to their level of veracity, their level of severity anyway. And thus, maybe even generally, it's better for people to be able to move, etc. The last argument from opening opposition then is on brain drain. Once again, look at the same two justifications. I'm unclear why brain drain is more important than what happens to these individuals, but giving opening opposition their due, the argument then becomes somewhat almost not a tension. It's not a knife, but there's a tension, which is the reason that brain drain would be successful is because predominantly richer people are leaving, not poorer people are leaving. But then opening government says, no, poorer people are ones that tend to leave, either because they have the need to leave, and also that's their reasoning to why they integrate into social level work and don't cause overcrowding effect to begin with. So if we take this other stakeholder, which is richer individuals now leave, and thus there are poorer people remaining in the country, they thus can have pressure to develop that country, and thus you wouldn't have brain drain. As opening government, I think, points out, brain drain seems largely symmetric, as in the richer people are leaving and being able to leave regardless. So all that's changing is, can the poorer people leave or not? Opening opposition saying, well, we prefer if they didn't leave, or we prefer if middle income people couldn't leave either, because then that creates a pressure for change. There's a distinction between pressure and capacity. So I do not think opening opposition has shown the capacity to change, even if there's an incentive to change. Even if it's true that the capacity does happen and somehow you stop brain drain, my big question would be what happened, like, why is that not seen in the world? But if that's true, there's examples, I suppose, in Bulgaria of this happening, for instance. There's a bit more mechanistic work to describe why more numbers means more sufficient pressure, it means sufficient levels of change, or why that sufficient level of change would combat the stuff opening government has about, like, does this mean that we're going to go from a war-torn Sudan environment to being non-war-torn? Seems that when we're talking about the level of violence opening government talks about with their actors, the margin to prove that those societies become so significantly changed by this open border policy isn't it that you achieved to be opening government here. Obviously, that commentary is closer. It does to be the closing government, which is why I start talking about it at the end. That is the end of the top half comparison. What happens in closing government's comparison? Closing government adds two extensions. First, that they say that opening opposition has conceded the notion that all that has to happen for nations to change is their incentives. I think this is a creative language to opening opposition. I don't actually think opening opposition opening opposition have admitted capacity analysis, but that doesn't mean the same thing as opening opposition thinks that capacity analysis doesn't matter. And indeed, as that's quite important because absence of closing government actually giving capacity analysis, they wouldn't be beating opening government, but I'll talk about that comparison in a second. It's far simpler and more straightforward to start with a short diagonal comparison because you're both talking about the same thing in the inverse. CG's on their developing nation thing, like say, when nations see people leaving, this is actually good because it incentivizes them to improve themselves, as opposed to opening opposition, which is like you need people to stay in that country in order to engineer the change in the first place. Recognize that second thing is actually a capacity mech, not an incentive mech. As in, they have in opening opposition justified that you need a capacity to force people to change their behavior, which is to have people remain in that country. You say no, actually countries would behave better if people have to leave and thus they'd be less oppressive. I think some of the examples here are, in my mind, widely unintuitive. So talking about like Xi Jinping would not do Uyghur genocide because if the Uyghurs could leave, he wouldn't genocide them. That just seems remarkably unintuitive. But the other underlying reasoning seem, I probably shouldn't have said, I said it on the recording, I'm never going to work in China now. Anyway, I didn't want to work in China anyway, is the level of reinvestment you have would shift political elites, etc. This becomes a closer comparison because to be fair to closing government, I don't think opening opposition have done that much work to describe why the incentives would shift in a way that would make them oppressive rather than positive. Except from a POI that you get from opening opposition, which is to point out that poverty is a good way in which you can consolidate power, corruption, and aspects of nepotism. Your re-challenge to this thing is to say, actually, the government needs things like taxation, economic development, which is why they would do the things that you say in response to migration, etc. Both things can actually coexist, interestingly. So it could be the case that you can have taxation by just raising taxes without actually having to make the economic position of people higher. But even if it's true that you're making people's economic position higher, does that actually improve their quality of life if as opening opposition gestures? There's lots of ways in which the bad aspects of governments, either by preventing you from leaving or by being harmful to you, stay the same. Here then, it comes down to a question of incentives and capacity again. I think the incentives becomes not a wash, but I have competing incentive structures, and I'm more liable to leave opening opposition based on that POI interaction, so they're more likely to tend negative than positive. But even if they intended positive, I'm unclear what the capacity change in this clash is. As in, are nations actually going to change so severely? Here then, it becomes important on the other question of what opening opposition poses, which is what happens when people move to those countries otherwise, as in moving them to America, etc. And the kind of restrictions those people have. as in they no longer can access amenities. There's a degree of unemployment. There's a lower quality of life. There's increased xenophobia and violence. There's not a sufficient level of unique response here from closing government to describe why that wouldn't be true. All their argument is the open borders would cause developing states to change, which I presume means you'd have people remain in that country. Obviously, that's the long-term version of that analysis, not the immediate-term version of that analysis. The opening opposition is still true that overcrowding exists. The only unique response we have from closing government is we can have repatriation of money, and that maybe it makes it better. As in, you'd go and work in America and send money back. But obviously, that requires you to be working successfully in America, and opening opposition's analysis is you're unlikely to do that with open borders, compared to the comparative where you would have gotten access to a less saturated market and would be able to have repatriation as well. That means on that argument of developing nations' incentives being sufficient to solve oppression, the burden, I think, is too high on that clash to be able to be immediately convincing to me, beyond what had happened in the first clash with arguments of overcrowding and the way in which immigrants are threats in new communities. The second thing closing government does is describe that this damages innovation in the private market, which is the thing that is predominantly weighed by the whip, which is the markets and desires that are distinct from what governments are doing. By allowing people to move freely, visas and etc., means that actual talent can move, which means you have better innovation, etc. Once again, I think the margin of this claim is underbaked. And I do not know if this is the be-all and end-all to actually creating a level of innovation, but I do accept the weighing here that some innovation would skyrocket to higher levels of innovation. The question becomes, is innovation more or less important than the quality of life of people in that country? Opening opposition have argued, and indeed opening government themselves have justified, why the people who are moving are likely not to be the most talented individuals. They're probably leaving anyway. So there's already a margin question on this. But independent of that, the quality of life of the vast majority of individuals per opening opposition to the world would be worse as a result of things like overcrowding. So it's unclear why innovation is a worthwhile trade-off here. So intuitively, I'm going to default to the thing that is the most scale in the round, which is the people who are largely being affected. Obviously, I can understand how giving a vaccine would affect loads of individuals, but given that I'm not sure how you get, if you actually get significantly more innovation than to improve people's lives on the comparative, then I'm not willing to do that work for you to understand how that clash should beat the other clash. That is the short diagonal. On the gov bench then, we had some disagreements about whether or not opening or closing government's analysis is stronger. So Jonathan thought that closing government's analysis was stronger because it applies to more numbers of instances than opening government's, and thus they are talking about a generic claims in the round that they thought that opening government had shirked the burden of. In my mind, and at the end of the discussion, this isn't true. So what opening government are doing is not shirking their burden, but they're adequately justifying why their burden shouldn't be necessarily general stuff. So the argument of asylum migration, for instance, is not just better proven, but by their weighing is more consequentially important than what happens to general migration. Also, I think their arguments in response to opening opposition on things like immigrant labor, migrant labor, what types of migrant labor look like in terms of being able to fill niches without having competition, and the fact they're moving locally rather than generally, meaning as a better defensive challenge against the argument of overcrowding, are all sufficient to explain why general migration, an increased level of general migration, wouldn't engender harm that could be beneficial for the people both in that country and the people who have not migrated, which I think was stronger analysis than closing government approving that burden as well. So that is how CG is losing to opening government. Last but not least, closing opposition. What does closing opposition do? They've run generally an analytical extension explaining why the level of backlash that you're likely to experience will be high. So they take the line from opening opposition, which is likely to be xenophobia and justification for xenophobia. They make us more convinced that this is a more likely manifestation around. There are three pieces of analysis, and I'll explain why they're more persuasive than opening government. Obviously, recognizing it would have been nice if the whip had weighed this analysis explicitly for us, but per the judge manual, I can do the weighing for you if I see it be intuitive to AIB, which I do. What is member of opposition? They say immigration is a very salient issue, and they use empirical examples to justify to us why it is. The examples of I think the example of Hungary and the fact that the historical basis of people's borders being uncertain is what means a lot of individuals, particularly in some areas of the world, are very salient of what happens to border issues, and the level of control is a good level of justification above opening government to describe why lots of people will care predominantly about what's happening in immigration and actually will care more about the nature of it being open as opposed to the consequences that happen. So opening opposition analysis is migration enters, there is overcrowding. The overcrowding then affects people's jobs and therefore they don't like them. Closing opposition is the nature of it being an open border means that people don't like it. So the number of burdens that need to be satisfied in order for this claim to be true are fewer, and the claim itself seems more intuitive. And it seems based on the justification, people would have this reaction to the notion of open borders. So in terms of the manifestation, the likely manifestation of xenophobia happening, that piece of analysis by closing opposition massively magnifies opening opposition's plausibility and applicability. The second piece of analysis then is the argument to why assimilation wouldn't actually happen, as well as it needs to in order to not to engender things like contact theory that would mean that you'd have humanization. So they say by having mass levels of immigration as opening opposition say, what would happen is you'd have a segregation from a local community. By doing that, you would no longer have the things you have in status quo, which is the reduction in level of fear, which means not only is that another reason why xenophobia increases, and it's a step-by-step mechanism that argues why that is likely to manifest to lots of individuals, that therefore means that I'm more convinced that xenophobia does manifest. Given that I think xenophobia, as opposed to the overcrowding arguments or the argument on what's the other second argument on economic development, is a far more certain and plausible thing that can happen in the round, as opposed to massive scale changes of economic development in one country, or the overcrowding argument, which I said had burdens within it that I do think are meaningfully satisfied, but not massively comprehensively satisfied. I think, as in, I have questions about if overcrowding does emerge as opening opposition points out, opening government sufficiently points out to me, and thus the analysis from closing opposition that reduces the burden is meaningful as a piece of analysis in the round. Obviously, it could be a different story if opening opposition has successfully proved overcrowding does emerge in a large instances. Then the analytical question would be slightly different in closing opposition. But because opening government has punctured this sufficiently, this is why another reason why the analysis is stronger. The third thing that closing opposition is able to do is to describe why the people's lives down that are there are likely to be worse as a result of the contact theory and dehumanization, as in not being offered things like rent levels, not being offered rent, not being offered a third space, being pushed out, having to go to lower cycles means you don't have labor protections, etc. These responses are good, better than opening opposition, because they challenge against opening government's arguments that the quality of life for these migrants, per some of the metrics opening government use, like integration, provision of lifestyle, the quality of life, is actually likely to be damaged. And we're more certain closing opposition, opening opposition, they are likely to be damaged as a result of xenophobia. Indeed, as they talked about the top half in terms of that POI interaction, we're willing to give some credit to opening opposition on the justification of xenophobia, but we are unclear about the level of xenophobia and the level of violence. Closing opposition provides that by describing to us why demonstrating to us why it's likely to be a large level of violence and exclusion. That is how closing opposition beats opening opposition. They don't beat opening governments for the same reasons opening opposition didn't, which is you can attack on the argument of xenophobia as much as you like. You need to respond to the argument that there are some people who can't enter into it, even if they had documentation and visas. Indeed, this is the POI you get from opening government, is people symmetrically want to reduce illegal immigration, and especially with the documentation, and the opposition with response to say, no, actually, it's better if we have documentation because then we wouldn't fear them. But then opening government's true. Most people don't have the documentation, which would engender the fear on your side. It's better that they actually are able to enter the country in the first place if fear becomes symmetric. And thus you're losing to opening government on that argumentation, especially because of the way on that clash is important in your engagement that clash most. Lastly, on back half then, same story, unfortunately, which is the clash about what happens to the quality of life through xenophobia is more persuasive, more proven, and more applicable than the general arguments of how governments change structures of oppression, or the arguments of innovation, which are higher burden and have been less satisfied to show that by they actually manifest that change in the round. There are some flippant responses by causing opposition, to be fair, but I do think the argument about the response from government whereby contact theory is enough to prevent people from disliking each other. I do think the response if that was true, slavery would have never happened. It's a flippant response, but does push the intuition successfully that it's not just people being around each other, but how they feel when they're around each other that's important. And thus the absence of opposition with engagement with the mechanization member of opposition provides about why xenophobia is likely to increase is quite damaging to government here. That is how we see the debate. Happy to stick around if you want any query, clarifications, or feedback. Good luck for the break. Good luck for the future. Enjoy wherever you are, morning, afternoon, or night.